Essas são as questões. Eu gostaria agora, então, de, colocadas algumas premissas para os discursos que teremos, que não têm que ser obrigatoriamente seguidos à risca, gostaria de pedir a palavra agora ao Lord John Browne. You go there. You go to the podium. Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to be here and to be appearing with such an illustrious panel. In the UK, there's now a political consensus in place on the importance of building new green industries, a way to both stimulate economic activity and satisfy the longer-term objectives of enhancing national security and mitigating climate change. The Brazilian sugarcane ethanol industry is the best example I can think of a successful precedent of what can be achieved when government and business work together. I want to make 3 short points. First, biofuels have the potential to play a substantial long-term role in the global energy mix. We mustn't lose the plot. Second, concerns about climate change are becoming the dominant driver of biofuels policies around the world, but the investment required to address these concerns is being held back by uncertainty surrounding the issue of land use change. And third, the biofuels industry needs to do a very much better job of communicating, uniting behind a common set of themes. The IEA's latest market report contains a striking fact that last year biofuels provided the single biggest increase in liquid fuels capacity outside OPEC. This didn't happen by accident or because of a passing fad. It's worth reminding ourselves that the biofuels industry has grown and continues to grow on the back of a number of long-term trends in the energy industry. First, the competitive position of biofuels compared with gasoline and diesel continues to improve thanks to the level and volatility of the oil price and to ongoing cost reductions. The past 12 months have served as a timely reminder that the only thing that we can say for sure about the oil market is that demand remains uncertain and that prices will vary. As a result of the global recession, demand for oil is much lower than expected even a few months ago, leading to significant spare capacity, a situation likely to persist for some time to come. However, at least 2 points on the supply side might suggest that the oil price is unlikely to weaken significantly and may firm over the medium to long term. OPEC's influence over price as its share of production grows, and the cost structure of the industry as the marginal barrel migrates to ever more technically challenging places. At the same time, the billions of dollars of investment in biofuels in recent years by oil companies, agribusinesses, and financial investors has led to significant cost reductions. Brazilian sugarcane ethanol, the lowest cost biofuel in the world, is now competitive without subsidies at $50 oil or so. Analysts predict that cellulosic biofuel costs will fall by 30% in the next few years. Another trend underpinning the growth of biofuels is the growing fear about energy security as supplies of fossil fuels become increasingly geographically concentrated. And these concerns are particularly acute in the transportation fuel sector, which remains 95% reliant on oil. The key to energy security is, of course, diversification, and biofuels remain the only material option to diversify in the short term, and one of the only very few options beyond that. Let me make just 1 or 2 more comments about energy security. There's a pervasive argument, one heard frequently in biofuels policy debates, that energy security can only be achieved by national or regional self-sufficiency, and that is mistaken. A lesson I've learned from my experience in the oil industry is that real energy security comes from open markets by ensuring a diversity of inputs, both domestic and international. And that means dismantling barriers to the formation of a global biofuels industry in tandem with domestic policies. Another factor supporting growth of the biofuel sector is the desire by governments around the world to promote new sources of economic activity. Developing countries in Africa and Asia are seeking to emulate the example of Brazil, where a biofuel sector now employs as many as 1 million people and has grown from virtually nothing over 30 years. In OECD, the green stimulus, so-called, has been enacted in recent months. It's estimated that 300 to 400 billion of the $3 trillion pledged in fiscal stimulus packages around the world will be dedicated to low-carbon energy, including bioenergy. The final trend underpinning the growth of the biofuels industry is, of course, increasing concerns about climate change. Put simply, policymakers have realized that stabilizing atmospheric concentrations of CO2 at safe levels is going to be impossible without significant growth of the global biofuels sector. The coming together of improved economics, growing energy insecurity, enhanced green stimulus policies, and increasing concerns about climate change explains why I believe the biofuels sector will continue to exhibit strong growth rates once it's overcome the current challenges of large product surpluses and compressed margins. However, the relative importance of these fundamentals is shifting, and this is my second point. For several years, one's heard a familiar refrain at conferences around the world. The dominant driver of biofuels policy in the United States is energy security, whereas environmental protection is more important in Europe. That might have been true historically, but the situation is changing dramatically under the new president's leadership. Climate change is now emerging as the most important driver of US energy policy, and it's moving from the margins to the mainstream. Let me illustrate that with a calculation. It's estimated that implementing the 36 billion gallon US renewable fuel standard would reduce gasoline demand by around 2.5 million barrels a day by 2020. And that's equivalent to a 30% reduction in the US gasoline demand, reinforcing the argument that demand for gasoline in the United States has probably already peaked. Significant progress has already been made, thanks in part to the activity of more than 1,500 clean tech funds. Technologies have been developed to make the next generation of biofuels from a range of low-carbon feedstocks, such as cellulosic biomass. Innovations are also playing out in farming and production processes, improving the carbon footprint of first-generation biofuels. Examples include the adoption of no-till farming practices in the Argentinian soy biodiesel industry, and here in Brazil, burning bagasse to create electricity. But more innovation is needed, and for the required investment to flow, investors need, above all else, clear, stable, and predictable government policies. My experience has taught me never to underestimate the ability of business to innovate if the right investment signals are there. Clear and robust gas standards have been introduced by the European Commission. California and the US EPA are now following suit. But clarity is being undermined by the impacts of conjectures of the impact of growing biofuels on land use. And this represents a serious roadblock. In my view, uncertainty as to the future shape of land use policies has become the single greatest impediment to investing in biofuels today. And land use change is an area rife with claim and counterclaim. Vested interest groups are stirring up unease. It's important to step back and to take stock of what we know. We know that growing biofuels, along with all agricultural activity, causes land use changes to occur. But we know that current models don't give sufficient certainty as to the magnitude of those changes, and that other factors, such as subsistence farming, are more important. We know that biofuels have positive as well as negative consequences on land use. Examples include increases in crop yield, as evidenced here in Brazil, and the production of high-protein co-products from the cereal refining process. We know that a suite of policies will be needed to address land use change concerns, including a large number of measures outside the biofuels sector. And we know, as a practical matter, that many approaches to mitigating direct land use change would also very probably mitigate indirect land use change. Based on those points, let me offer 3 do's and don'ts to policymakers. Don't make knee-jerk policy decisions or put up trade barriers based on an area of science that is embryonic and where both the direction and magnitude of effects remains highly uncertain. Avoid penalty factors. Carrots are far more important than sticks in changing business practice. And don't be too parochial. Understanding global land use dynamics will be impossible without looking at the agricultural system as a whole, a system in which biofuels plays only a very small part. When it comes to the do's, do recognize existing government and industry initiatives, for example, land zoning laws and policies to prevent deforestation. Do aim for internationally harmonized approaches, recognizing biofuels as an emerging global commodity. And finally, do outline the practical steps producers can take today that would have a high probability of mitigating land use impacts. For example, deploying biofuels technologies that process waste products, growing crops on degraded land, and demonstrating agricultural yield improvements. Without greater clarity, the investment required to meet increasingly aggressive government mandates will simply not flow. But if policymakers need to be more empathetic to the concerns of business, the same is true the other way round. And this leads to my third and final point. As a global investor in biofuels, with investments in Europe, Brazil, Argentina, and the US, and in both bioethanol and biodiesel, it seems to me that the industry needs to do a better job of explaining how it can meet government priorities. In the 1990s, some parts of the oil industry chose to ignore or deny emerging climate change science. Other companies, including BP, which I was leading at the time, decided that constructive engagement was a better approach, and I believe that we've been proved right. There is an important lesson to be learned here for the biofuels industry, as it grapples with its own emerging environmental issues. Defensiveness and denial are not viable long-term strategies. Like the oil industry in the 1990s, there's also been a tendency for players to fragment into rival groupings rather than presenting a united front. At times of great uncertainty and great complexity, speaking with a common voice becomes even more important. And I believe the time is ripe to open a new chapter in advocacy efforts based on cross-industry partnerships and shared and positive messages. As well as articulating a constructive way forward on land use change, the public and policy